afternoon. Thank you. It's truly a tremendous pleasure for Oxfam to be able to welcome you all today. My name is Nabil Ahmed. I'm Economic and Racial Justice Director at Oxfam America, and it's truly my privilege to welcome you together with my colleague Kate Donald, who's head of Oxfam International's D.C. office. Let's get straight into it. Today is about remaking global economic governance for a post-neoliberal era. It's about two institutions that have been the handmaidens to today's extreme inequality crisis, in service to the world's richest countries and to the richest 1% in country after country. I am, of course, talking about the IMF and the World Bank. And today's a conversation situated not in the colonial era of 1944, when these institutions were created, nor in the decades after, in which those former colonies' attempts at economic liberation was thwarted by neoliberalism. But it's a conversation in 2024, when yes, there's talk and hope for post-neoliberalism in cities around the world, including here in DC. Yes, there's the arrival of a more multipolar world, but more so, as Oxfam's witness to in movements around the world, you can see a fight on in the streets. You can hear the whispers of people's dreams, reimagining an economy that meets their dignity and human rights. Here's how the program will run between now and 2 p.m. First, it's my pleasure to welcome Abby Maxman, President of Oxfam America, for a reflection on the central question of the day. And second, to the panel discussion Q&A. And the panel will be led and moderated by none other than Rana Foroohar, global business columnist and associate editor of the Financial Times. The panel is joined by Dr. Adriana Abdenur, special advisor to the Presidency of Brazil President Lula. Adriana, when we last met in Brasilia, it was clear that Brazil's not only welcoming top thinkers into government, but putting your ideas into policy. We're joined by Dr. Ndongo Samba Sylla from Senegal of International Development Economics Associates, one of today's pioneering scholars whose vision for economic liberation is changing the game. And we welcome Nobel Laureate, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who really needs no introduction. And call me Stiglitzian, but suffice to say, Joe, that this post-neoliberal moment would not exist without you today. And your new book reminds us where our work must lead us on the road to freedom. And it's joined by all of you, of course, and I really don't take for granted that we can convene and bring together a room like this to be able to grapple together with the issue of global economic governance. So I thank you all. With my gratitude to you, Abby, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nabil and Kate and all of our allies and partners who have been working at the fore of this work. And leaders, and I address everyone in this room as leaders from the administration, the IFIs, journalism, academia, civil society. I want to touch first just on three things before we get started with this incredible panel. First, on reform. Second, on the US. And finally, about what Oxfam's up to. So first, we hear a lot about IFI reform. And perhaps transformation is the word we need to start using if we're going to stand a chance of closing the gap between the institutions we have and the ones that we need. Our world faces extreme inequalities that undermine poverty reduction, fuel the climate crisis, and are eroding democracy the world over. We know that billionaire wealth is up by over $3 trillion since 2020. And while wealth is down for 5 billion people, and the bank's research shows the fight against poverty has stalled. Now, our world is also one in which 57% of the world's poorest countries are having a dramatically cut public spending, often at the behest of the IMF. A world in which public funds too often underwrite a free-for-all for the private sector with severe human costs, as our analysis of IFC investments show. And to be clear, I say this with recognition of those pushing for progress beyond the rhetoric the fund and the bank remain the stewards of fundamentally neoliberal policies and approaches. So we need transformation to policies, to programs, and yes, to power. Second, a word for my fellow Americans in the room, especially those of us who have the privilege to be here so close to this seat of power. We currently bear a large share of responsibility for what the bank and the fund do, but we can do things differently. Today, we're seeing a breakthrough for the first time in a generation in domestic economic policy, from pushing to tax the ultra-rich and strengthen labor power, to industrial policy and taking on corporate monopolies. And that's real, and that's hopeful. And yet, it feels a new economics is being born at home. It seems like the US is still delivering old Reaganomics abroad. It's about the IFIs, but also issues from tax to debt to intellectual property rules. The new progressivism has to be extended to the international domain, and the US needs to, at least, recognize its responsibility to do no harm. Better still, we need to inclusively work with others, particularly those who have borne the brunt of these policies. They are assertively saying no more. So let's work together to build a new way of designing our global economy to meet human rights. And last, about Oxfam. This convening today is, and I'm excited to announce, the first of this new initiative. And it builds upon the work being done by our allies and by my Oxfam colleagues in more than 80 countries around the world. It's a new initiative in which we work with others at the frontiers of remaking global economic thinking. That's the idea, to help inject more ambition into global economic thinking in support of global movements and alliances, and doing so with policymakers, actors in media, civil society, and scholars too, partnering with Grieve Chalwa to work with Global South scholars as well. So that journey today is just beginning. And I want to thank the Ford Foundation and Solly Booker for their strategic partnership and with us and others to this end. And we welcome others on this journey. And what a better way to begin than hearing from Joe, Rana, Adriana, and Ndongo. Over to you to take the stage. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Oxfam, Ford Foundation, everyone who's supporting this event. I am so delighted to be here with a panel. I cannot imagine really a better group of people to discuss this topic. Yeah, get your waters organized. We're going to need them because you're going to be talking fast. I want to start by saying, and we're going to have about a half an hour ourselves to talk, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So have those questions ready. I know that there's several journalists in the audience. Let me just start by saying I have written a lot about the post-neoliberal paradigm. I've been incredibly encouraged by a lot of what this Biden administration has done to try and move beyond conventional economic thinking. And yet, I'm aware that when we think about this, particularly in a global context, it's almost like we're giving the U.S. a lot of credit, but we're starting from zero. So if you go to 2, you know, you're feeling really good about yourself. We still have a lot of gaps and a lot of thinking to be done, both at a sort of paradigm level, but an operational level in creating this new world. We're going to draw out a lot of what's happening, and this is going to be a big, rich conversation, and I hope one of many. But let me start, Joe. I'm going to turn to you first because you know where all the bodies are buried here, and you really are in an incredible place as one of the first people to criticize and prove the economic flaws in the neoliberal model, to kind of sketch where we've come from, where we're going, and in particular, if you had to sort of compare the world in which the World Bank, the IMF, the global trading paradigm were created post-World War II versus today, how would you say these institutions are built at this stage to serve those two worlds? What, how, if you were going to start from scratch today, what would you do differently, I guess is the simple way of putting this.
Yeah. Thank you, and it's really great to be here, and it's great to have a topic like this, like something I've been agitating for a very long time. And I think both Ron and Abby gave a very good introduction to the scene. Let me first begin. The world today is very different from 1944, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created. It's very different in a number of ways. One of the important ways Abby brought out, in 1944, most of the developing countries were colonies. And it wasn't even really conceived that they wouldn't be colonies. The whole liberation happened after 1944. Then the economics of the day was also very different. Keynes assumed that you would not want to have free capital mobility. He just, it was obvious to him that free capital mobility was a bad thing. Short-term capitalism, short-termism, he worried about that. So it was a very different financial architecture. What has happened then, we went from that colonial period into what might be called neo-colonial period. The remarkable thing is that today, 50, 60 years after the official end of colonialism, patterns of trade are very much the same. The developing countries still produce primary products that are, value added occurs in the advanced countries. And it's not an accident. The whole structure, trade structure, escalating tariffs, I could describe the whole process, which has maintained that colonial pattern, has continued. But then something made things, I think, worse in the global economic architecture was neoliberalism. I don't think Keynes would have ever anticipated the triumph of neoliberalism. The idea and the irony is that the theoretical ideas underlying neoliberalism, that unfettered markets lead as if by an invisible hand to the efficiency of the market, were refuted before neoliberalism became fashionable. I think of my own contribution in part as showing that the reason the visible hand is invisible is that it's not there, and showing that markets are. The presumption is that markets are not efficient, and the problem is the inefficiencies are so pervasive. The issue of policy is to try to identify the most important ones to intervene. And one particular aspect of that change in neoliberalism was the growth of financial markets. And that has changed the political dynamics enormously. We were talking about, how do governments score themselves. It's how the stock market does. Yeah. That doesn't have anything to do with the well-being of people, and countries, developing countries, including Brazil, worry that if they choose the wrong policy, financial markets will give them a bad grade, take the money out of their country, and there could be a crisis. So we've gone from an economic environment that is much worse than it was in 1944. Well, now we're at an interesting moment, 60 years after, 70 years after the official end of colonialism, and the level of, you might say, human capital has increased enormously. The economic power is increased enormously. The emerging markets now have, the BRICS alone have an income larger than the advanced countries' income in 1944. much larger, so that the heft, the economic heft, is larger. So there's been a change in economic power. There is the era in which neoliberalism was really strong was when people like Francis Fukuyama would write The End of History, believed that everybody would converge to liberal democracies and free market economies. That's over.
Yeah.
And so we're in a new world of geopolitics.
And it's a new world that in which we have institutions that simply aren't purpose-built for the moment, which I want to actually, I'm going to have you pause for one moment, and I want to come back to you on structure, if I may.
Yeah, can I answer two specific questions before I come to structure? Because I think if we were starting today, what we would change most dramatically would be the governance of these institutions and their mandates. And by mandates, I mean we would think about global public goods. We would think about the necessity of global cooperation and climate change and in pandemics and creating institutions that would help facilitate that. So those are the two things I wanted to emphasize. If I were starting today, those are the two things that would be most
pressing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it's profound because it's a very different starting place. It's a fundamentally different starting place. I also just want to draw. I think the point that financial markets are not necessarily rational. In fact, a lot of the times they aren't. And this myth of efficient capital markets, I think that cannot be drawn home clearly enough, particularly at this moment when, I thought we'd reached peak financialization right after the financial crisis. No, we still have, it appears we have longer to go. So with that, Adriana, I want to actually turn to you, because one of the things that I find interesting about the current moment is that, all right, as I've heard you say before, it's as though, the U.S. finally read some UNCTAD papers and realized that, hey, we can have an industrial strategy for the benefit of someone aside from shareholders. That's a good idea. So that's happening. And, we want to support this vectorally, but we still have a hyper neoliberal financial market. And that divide between how the global financial market still works and how the IFIs work, and the way in which rich countries are now taking on industrial strategy in ways that may have some benefits, but also could lead to preferencing, could lead to national champions, and could be a net loss for the global South if we're not careful. Yeah.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you to Oxfam for this event, and it's an honor to be here on the stage. I also want to thank the opportunity that our team from the Brazilian government has had to exchange ideas with so many actors, whether think tanks, different governments, the Bretton Woods institutions themselves. As holding the presidency of the G20, it's absolutely essential so that we can generate new ideas and make some progress. I also wanted to just start with a caveat. As a special advisor in the president's office, my job is to think more in a more exploratory way, and today I'll be speaking in a personal capacity. So to address your question, Hannah, and thank you for starting with such a great one, we have this clear mismatch going on where rich countries and regions are now openly espousing and defending industrial policy, which I believe they always did. Obviously, they're right. They're just openly doing it now, and obviously, in the case of the United States, injecting a lot of resources into this. In the case of the European Green Deal, using a different set of policy instruments, but they are still pushing the international financial institutions to impose an outdated prescription of Washington consensus that basically takes us in two directions. For many countries, there's the imposition from the outside of austerity that creates many difficulties in terms of implementing social policies. But then there's a partnership between this system and hyper financialization approach. They work hand in hand. It's a clear partnership. I don't think there is tension between these different components of the system. And we have to better understand the ways in which this might be feeding into inequalities rather than improving them. And there are many different instances we can look at. The case of the crisis of sovereign debt is a very clear example where countries get locked into this system and they spend more on debt payment than on education and health. In fact, there's a massive amount of the world's population living in these countries. And they can't dig themselves out of this hole, for instance, because the surcharges are so exorbitant and because the imposition of conditionality keeps them from altering their productive structure, from diversifying their economies, and even for tackling challenges like climate or the growing digital divide. So I think we need to think systemically in order to address, not just tweak, but really try to have deeper reforms. I agree very much that we need more democratic governance. President Lula has repeated this many times over the last few years, and he has said that when he came back to the presidency of Brazil for the third time on January 1st of last year, he felt extremely frustrated about the discussion of governance reform in Bretton Woods because he had faced the same discussions back when he was first president. And the discussion has hardly moved, because in Brazil, a centimeter. It has even moved an inch, maybe a centimeter. And this is at the heart. It's not a cure-all, but it's a necessary step so that we have a more just system that will help us combat poverty and inequality, address global public goods, but also, Dr. Stiglitz, address local public goods, which are getting cast out with this excessive emphasis just on global challenges, and have a fairer system based on a precautionary principle.
That is such a great answer to a very complicated question. And also, I just want to amplify for those that are joining that are not part of the sort of wonky acronym-filled technocratic world that many of us live in and write for. When we think about financialization, we're really talking about a financial system that has become the tail that wags the dog of the real economy. This notion that you're talking about of, spending, developing countries spending the majority of their time and money paying back capital markets as opposed to taking care of their own population. Is there's something profoundly wrong with that, as is the fact that you have a financial economy that is 4 times the size of the real economy, or a commodities market that is exploiting supply chain disasters or wars to price gouge. So this is all kind of part of this disparate problem that we're talking about here. Ndongo, I want to move to you. Tell me your thoughts. If we think about stepping back from the really big systemic problems and just thinking about the IFIs, the bank, the IMF, discreetly for a moment, tell me your thoughts on whether the Bretton Woods system can actually be reformed or whether you'd like to start from scratch.
This is a good question. Well, Professor Stiglitz said that these institutions were created during colonial times. And I think we could say that there is a kind of original sin of the Bretton Woods institutions, in the sense that when they were created, most of the, territories were still under colonialism in Africa and in Asia. Generally, we hear the call about having a new Bretton Woods system because it has been associated with progressive policies such as capital controls, trade controls, etc. But nonetheless, it is still a US-centric framing in the sense that the interest of the people from the global south, namely Asia and Africa, were articulated, 10 years afterwards in 1955 with the Bandung Conference. And the Bandung Conference, to some extent, was the moment from the global south to say that we want a kind of a new international economic order. And from that, we would have the non-aligned movements, etc., and the UNCTAD, and also the new international economic order. And this year we are celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the new international economic order. So that means that from the perspective of the global south, the reference has not been Bretton Woods, but something else, new international economic order. And when this new international economic order was launched in 1974, the response of the, let's say, global north institutions, which coincided with the international debt crisis, has been the imposition of austerity policies. I mean, last decades in Africa and Latin America. And since then, I mean, in Africa, when you talk about IMF and the World Bank, they don't have a good reputation there, because most of the people, they could, remember what happened during social arrangement plans. That means people were laid off, no more subsidies to agriculture, no more subsidies to industry, etc., and the growth of the informal sector. And that's how African countries and also others in the global south lost economic decades. And we could see that the purpose of structural adjustment plans by these institutions have never been about addressing the debt crisis, but just to postpone it in the sense that, for example, the debt to GDP ratio in Africa started to decline only after structural adjustment plans, in the sense that there had been an environment of better commodity prices and debt cancellations. That's the only way you could address a debt crisis, debt cancellation and better prices for the raw materials, as most African countries are still exporting commodities. So these institutions do not seem to be reformable.
I'm going to actually ask Joe, I'm going to ask you now to step in and build a little bit more on this idea of institutional reform. And you've been part of this conversation for many decades now. Have we reached a tipping point where we really do need to, start over with different institutions or create new institutions to push the old ones? I mean, how will all this come together, do you imagine?
Yeah, so one way to begin thinking about the conversation was something that Abby mentioned, which relates to the voice of the U.S. is very large in both of these organizations. IMF is the only country that has the veto power, but U.S. and Europe really control the World Bank. And when I came from being chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors to becoming the chief economist of the World Bank, what struck me was how the progressive policies that Clinton was pushing, and they weren't all that progressive, but to the extent there were progressive policies, when it came to the bank, they were not progressive at all. In fact, the Undersecretary of Treasury told me how at the very beginning of his administration he had gone down to Brazil and told them, if you think that we're going to be any different from the previous Republican administration, you're wrong. And it was really about continuity of Treasury policy. And this was before really the era of financialization. And you saw it over and over again. We were trying to create a good public Social Security program. We were telling Chile and other countries to privatize their Social Security program. So the disconnect between what was going on in the United States and what was going on in the rest at the World Bank and the IMF was just enormous, and that was part of it. I couldn't manage that kind of cognitive dissonance, and that's
a good thing, Joe. That speaks well of your character.
When you ask how is reform going to come, or should you create new institutions, I think the answer is both. I believe in pluralism, in some degree of competition, and challenging the existing institutions. In Latin America, there is a Latin American Development Bank that is really owned by the countries of Latin America, CAF, C-A-F-E. And it's been very effective, and it's been growing, and it doesn't have the overtone or the reality of what the other multilateral MDBs have because of their governing structure. I was hopeful. I was very involved in the creation of the BRICS Bank, and it was very clear that the world needed more money for green investment beyond the capacity of the World Bank, and as I mentioned before, it was so clear also that the BRICS had the economic resources. They were stronger than the advanced countries were in 1944. So this was a project that would actually bring these countries together.
Yeah.
So that was part of the idea behind the BRICS Bank, and you know, the world geopolitics has changed since then, and so you can't quite predict where things are going to go. But there's one point I want to make, which really is a contrast. I think development banks are an important institution for industrial policy, for development, and there is a little bit of a flavor in a lot of the MDBs and what goes on in the standard that their job is to facilitate the private sector as opposed to being an institution on their own to make judgments about good investments and so forth. And one way of thinking about I might say the absurdity of the current arrangements is central banks basically create liquidity, and they give the liquidity to the private sector, and then the private sector gives the liquidity to the developing countries, focusing on short term. I mean, the private sector is basically short term.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, if they could do that, why don't they give that same liquidity to the development banks who have a long-term perspective?
It's interesting. I mean, you're getting at a kind of a profound point, which is that in this new world, we're actually moving beyond one paradigm, which is this sort of highly financialized, let the private sector do what it does, even if it's short term, into a world in which there's different choices now. And there are different choices of how to structure financial institutions, but there are different political economies out there right now. Now, I want to ask Adriana and Ndongo a question about this. Oftentimes, in the media, you will see this new, let's call it a more multipolar world, portrayed as a bad thing, as a sort of a dangerous thing. How much do you worry about where smaller countries, developing countries, might be in a kind of a great power conflict that could arise in this new world? And how much do you think, hey, we're letting dozens, hundreds, thousands of new flowers bloom right now, and that's not a bad thing? Ndongo, maybe do you want to sound off on that?
I think the rise of multipolarity is good news for the global system, and especially for the global south, because it allows them to have other options and more policy space, in the sense that, for example, many countries, generally they have to earn US dollars to be able to import the things they need. But now, if you look, for example, the case of China, because the context we are living is to some extent different from the context post-Bretton Woods. Because at that time, you have the US dollar at the center of industrial manufacturing and also issuing the dominant currency. But now you have many countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, etc., which are producing manufacturing products and which are ready to provide, for example, alternative payment arrangements to the global south. So to some extent, this allows them to ease their balance of payment constraint. And this allows them to at least have pursue other more progressive economic policies. So I think this rise of multipolarity is really important. And I think this could create a kind of competition that is needed so that the current international financial institutions may try to adjust and to become more relevant. And
adjust and become more relevant.
Yeah. And one thing to say is that when we look also at the demographic trends projected by the United Nations, for example, we'll see that by the end of this century, 90% of world population will live between Asia and Africa. So when we look at this from this perspective, it is clear that these institutions could not continue to function the way they function. The international financial system has to reflect these growing demographic trends, but also the recomposition, of geopolitical powers.
Yeah, Adriana, I know you're chomping at the bit. You've got a bunch of thoughts here. I can see.
Thank you. No, I was actually just quickly jotting down what I was hearing, but yes, I agree very much. I think from Brazil's perspective, multipolarity is a positive trend, and it's a position that President Lula has defended in his previous governments as well. However, multipolarity within a context of the crisis of multilateralism takes us in direction of greater uncertainty, and so we have to work together to manage this uncertainty. This also means that institutions become more permeable to geopolitical disputes, and this is very present in the discussions on reform of the international financial system. Within the G20, our team faces this major challenge of ensuring that the G20, which is a very strategic place, especially at this moment, because it brings together countries of the global south and advanced economies together at the same table, and yet there's always a risk of discussions that could be very productive getting derailed by geopolitical tensions. And we have amazing diplomats who are, trying to steer the conversation in productive directions, but it's definitely a very challenging context. And within the context of the just transition, I think this is also very important to consider, because as I was saying in the beginning, you have this movement taking place in the rich countries and regions, but it's happening not with the developing world, but rather at the expense of the developing world. There are many negative externalities that are taking place. The increase in the cost of capital as a result of IRA and the European New Deal. You have the dumping of outdated technologies in developing countries. You have an increasing gap, for instance, in the digital sphere. And you have policies like CBAM coming out of Europe, where the European Union doesn't want to address head-on its dirty sectors, and instead is punishing the developing countries by imposing a carbon tax. What does this mean within a crisis of multilateralism, in which, for instance, the World Trade Organization is without, not without function, I think it still has function, but we need to think very carefully about where we are headed. Do we all want to design our own CBAM, unilateral policies, and see what can we make of this? Or do we want to get back to the multilateral table and discuss how, for instance, trade policy can help to drive sustainable development? Because that was a series of missed opportunities to link those conversations, and maybe we still have time to go in that direction.
I love that. You set up exactly where I wanted to go, actually. Joe, you had a thought or a question that you wanted to add?
Well, both a thought and a question. The question is, occasionally the U.S. has taken a stance of trying to force developing countries to choose, for instance, about what technology you will use for. And obviously that's an adverse, and for a while they were trying to do that even within the World Bank, put pressure that if you took money from China, you couldn't take, I'd like to get a reaction about how serious that is.
That's interesting.
That's a great question. Thank you. So technology transfer, in addition to technology development and access to technology, has always been very important to Brazil. But within the context of the just transition, it's become even more strategic, because ultimately just transition is not just about reconfiguring your labor force and adapting to structural changes in the world economy. It's also about technological pathways that will take us in the direction of tackling poverty, inequality, and hunger. And therefore, partnerships and cooperation arrangements that enable this are more valuable than those that lock us into relationships where we don't have this capability. And I think it gets back to the question of a multipolar world. Those partners who offer more technological advantages will be better off when it comes to their relationships with the global south. We all need to transition. We have to stop talking about a just transition at a national level, and we need to start talking about global transition, and technology is part of that conversation.
Ndongo, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I would say I would agree with the idea that we need to talk about a global transition. And we could see that, for example, if we take the case of African countries, I suspect most countries of the global south, the countries that are able to, escape cycles of debt distress are countries that generally have current account surpluses. They amass, US dollar, deposits. And generally, these countries, they do that by destroying the environment. That means by exploiting fossil fuels and also, the mining industries. So that means that for most of the countries, the only way you could escape debt distress and going through the IMF, etc., austerity policies is through destroying the environment. So that means that if we think of the global level, for most countries, we need net transfer of resources, but transfer of resources that will not create technological dependencies and ultimately financial dependency.
This is so interesting. I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then we're going to open it up. Staying on this topic, Joe, you raised, and Adriana, really interesting point about Europe's CBAM, the carbon trading mechanism that Europe wants to put forward as a way to, that is putting forward actually as a way to address climate change, but many people feel penalizes the global south, which hasn't been having a chance to put forward all these emissions that rich countries have. So let's look at how Europe's approach compares to what the U.S. is trying to do, but also some of the risks of both. And I want to get your thoughts on what USTR Catherine Tai has called for with a post-colonial trade paradigm. And that's an idea that's out there. Meat is still being put on the bones here, but and I fingers crossed it will continue to be. But what does that look like, and how do you balance, I think, the appropriate rejection of a mythology of perfect markets, which is, what's problematic with CBAM in some ways, with the risks in industrial strategy of a winner-take-all, of preferencing national champions, of the U.S. simply, as you sort of pointed out in the beginning, Adriana, using this to just openly preference its own industries. How do you translate that in a really just way to the rest of the world to make this transition happen more quickly? Joe, do you want to have the first word?
Yeah. I think first one has to understand that the United States and Europe have, for a long time, have very asymmetric policies, even though WTO rules look symmetric. So for a long time, as you pointed out, we told countries you can't have industrial policies. But inside our Defense Department, we had a very strong industrial policy, and we developed the internet. We had within our research lab, we developed a strong pharmaceutical industry. We had an industrial policy. Industrial policy, all we mean is not industry, but promoting particular sectors. We had a policy that promoted the financial sector with all kinds of tax
still
subsidy.
Do, really.
We still do. So we engaged in those policies that we told other countries not to do. This is going on in a very dramatic way today. You mentioned CBAM. Another example of that, where Europe is really the culprit, is Indonesia has said that it wants to develop its nickel, but it doesn't want its nickel just to be taken out of Indonesia. It wants the stages of production
to go up the supply chain, value chain.
Value chain, and Europe is suing them and saying that those restrictions are violate the WTO. And
Yeah.
I
This is weaponizing the rules in some way.
and I talked to the finance minister who was a good trained, well trained economist in the United States, and she said her first belief was skeptical, and she said, "I've looked at how it works, and it's really working.
Interesting.
It's more powerful than anything that we've been able to do." So, but Europe wants to stop that kind of development. One of the things that worries me is the legacy of the old rules are there, enforced against the developing countries and emerging markets, but not against the United States. So you take industrial policy subsidies. What the United States is doing is almost clearly in violation of the rules. Is anybody going to hold U.S. accountable? Of course not. But think about a few years ago when South Africa and India wanted to use intellectual property to save their citizens and the world from COVID-19.
It's so interesting because actually, China is trying to hold the U.S. accountable, taking America to the WTO over the IRA. On the other hand, that's kind of a cage match because it's subsidy v. subsidy, great power conflict.
We've defenestrated the WTO appeals panel. There are not enough judges there.
That's right. That's right.
So
capacity is another conference, I think.
We've really made it impossible for anybody to judge us.
I want to give both of the other panelists a quick moment to sound off on, and then we're going to open it to questions. Where's the low-hanging fruit here in moving to a new paradigm? Where do you see some progress, some levers that you think could be pulled right now? Adriana.
I want to talk about the high-hanging fruit, but...
All right, all the fruit. Pick the fruit you like.
That's the task of Oxfam, to push us higher and higher up the tree. So I don't know if I can call them exactly low-hanging fruit, but I think there are spaces of hope appearing within the G20 that are promising. And Dr. Stiglitz has been a part of the conversation about international cooperation on taxation. We're very thankful to our African friends who managed to kind of pull the conversation away from the exclusive space that is the OECD and helping to land this squarely within the UN, which is a more democratic space. And I think there's a lot of goodwill on the part of many actors, North and South. So this is one place where we can push in the right direction. Another place of hope, I think, is we've formed two task forces which bring together the two tracks of the G20. One is dedicated to mobilizing countries against climate change, and the other one is a task force against hunger and poverty. And by the way, it's not a task force on food security, because the assuring global supply chains of food is part of the problem, but it's not exclusively the problem. And we need to think about access and equal distribution and nutrition and malnutrition and many other social aspects, not just security aspects. And the reason I think this is a space of hope is that rather than reinvent the wheel in a field that's actually quite crowded but fragmented, what the Task Force Against Hunger and Poverty does, it harnesses existing initiatives and sources of funding and tries to harmonize them and develops a call to action for countries that want to sign up, provides a basket of proven policies that have effects against inequality and hunger. And I think this is a kind of smart, if you liked, since I'm on Washington, I'll say it, efficient use of the G20. And these are concrete examples of how we're trying to operationalize the message that President Lula gave at the very beginning of the Brazilian presidency of the G20. Mainstream inequality and find ways to fight it. Thank you.
Wonderful point. Ndongo, last word to you.
Yeah. I think there is a need to articulate very urgent concerns with long-term ones. Now, in most of the global south, there is a debt crisis that is unfolding. And if we do not address that, I mean, it will be very complicated in the sense that you could not weaken first the countries and accept them to have, the leverage to change the global system. And if you take most of the global south countries, their debt stock, foreign debt stock, it's peanuts. I mean, if you take the more than 130 low and middle income countries, you accept China, Russia, India, it's 2.6 trillion US dollar. It's less than Germany's public federal debt. So that means that there are things that could be done in order to relieve these countries, from this distress. That's the second thing is that, as said by Abdenur, that we need more cooperation on tax issues, because most of the African countries, and this is not something that we generally, there is no focus on that. But in Africa, we have a plunder problem. When I say we have a plunder problem, in Latin America, in Asia, you have big state companies that have the technical capacity to monitor the export sectors. But when you look at all this literature on illicit financial flows, you see that most African countries are, in principle, net creditors to the rest of the economy. But simply, they do not have the technical capacity, or sometimes, the transnational corporations manage to evade taxation, etc. So this creates a lot of problems for them.
Okay, we have so much more we talk about, but I want to give others a chance to ask questions. Annie, you have, I think, mic in the back there. And are there any folks that had questions earlier that I don't know if you want to call out any journalists that, over there? Okay, great.
Hi, I'm Jim Kaysen. I write for a newspaper in Mexico called La Jornada. And I wondered if particularly the folks from the Global South could talk a little bit about, you talked about moving to a new paradigm. And I'm wondering if you could name some names about the governments other than Brazil that are helping to move the Global South to take advantage of this multipolarity to a new paradigm. What are the governments that are helping, and what are the governments that are missing that one would think would help? And then as the second question, where do you see the best civil society organizing, again in the Global South, to try to push their governments to take advantage of this new paradigm?
That's a great question. Adriana, do you want to start with that?
Sure, thank you for your question. I think there are many countries that have done a lot to push forward elements of this discussion on reform of the international financial system. I can name, for instance, Barbados, Kenya, France. They all held summits and big meetings to discuss different components. And we're very grateful to these efforts because they help us think through alternatives in the G20. Within the BRICS, I would say that we have a space, curiously enough, where we can have even more progressive discussions about certain topics that are very taboo here in Washington. Remembering that I'm speaking on a personal capacity, but let me mention some of these. Credit rating agencies. How do we have that discussion? How do we open up that black box? The global impact of unilateral sanctions, because they have a massive impact. Commodity price volatility, and even the issue of governance reform at Bretton Woods and at the new green funds, which, by the way, tend to reproduce the outdated logic of governance of Bretton Woods. These are topics that we feel very comfortable talking within the BRICS, but for political reasons, it's very difficult to start these conversations here or even within the G20. President Lula talks about some of these elements, but I think we need a broad coalition, and not just of states, but also civil society, of think tanks, private sector actors, to help us think about this shift of paradigm. Within our G20, let me just mention, in addition to having the traditional, if you can we already say the traditional elements of the G20, which are the engagement groups. So you have the T20, the think tanks, the C20, the civil society. Brazil has also created the G20 social, which is a broader, looser space, but in recognition that there are many actors that traditionally have not engaged with this discussion that should be brought in. And in Brazil, it's wonderful to see that we have, black rights movements, we have indigenous groups that historically have not taken part, and they are engaging with this, which is why, by the way, as I said to Rana at the very beginning, it's so important that here in Washington, that during these summits, we try to have as accessible language as possible so that we make this conversation more democratic, more just, and ultimately more effective.
P.S. Accessible language is usually smarter language. So just FYI, if somebody's making it complicated, they're trying to hide something. Joe, quickly, did you want to add a couple?
Oh, I just wanted to add a couple examples. I mentioned Indonesia as one country, but another one of the problems is governments are often split. So I was going to mention a president of a country, which was Chile, Gabriel Boric. When he won his primary, said famously, if neoliberalism was born in Chile, it will be buried in Chile.
So great. Other questions? We have a mic over there. A recounting of a question. All right, come on, this is a shy audience. This is your chance. All right, hands up.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sylla from the World Bank, and I'm surprised, gladly surprised, that no one talked about devolution here. So I want to ask about the evolution process to you, and think, given that the evolution process is the conversation that the World Bank given to itself to reform itself, and now is shaping in a way all the conversation of how the MDBs are going to be reformed. I want to ask you about how do you think the implications of this conversation in the World Bank and the MDBs for this broader effort to reform the IFI? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that one? Sorry. Joe, do you want to?
Well, I mean, let me say, one of the problem is that it's very hard for the IFIs, for say the IMF, to discuss the issue of reform and governance because the critical issue is that it would entail U.S. giving up its veto power, and it would be a redistribution of voting power to emerging markets and developing countries. And, the one thing about power is that those with power don't like to give it up. So, that in the very inherently, it is only going to be, that's why I mentioned creating new institutions with different governance may only be the way that force it if it wants to stay relevant, to say, we have to change a little gradually. And it's also particularly difficult right now in America's political context because one party will say, if the other party gives up that voting power, that you've surrendered our influence in the world. But of course, it would actually enhance our influence because when we're being criticized, as we've been here, because that doesn't help our influence. When we have vaccine apartheid, it doesn't help our influence. So in some sense, tying our hands may be the best way to increase the U.S. influence.
That's such an interesting point, and I think the fact that we didn't cover it actually sort of reflects something important about where we are. We have time for maybe one more burning question. Let's take one right here.
Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to. I'm a civil society actor from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights based in Uganda, and it's always a pleasure when I hear non-CSOs making the arguments that so many of us have been making for a while. So I'm particularly a fan. But I wondered, this was triggered by her last comment around the evolution roadmap, because you rightfully prescribed the problem. And when we were in Marrakesh last year, we noted it's 50 years, and given the troubled legacy, this is a time to really reassess things. But when you look at the evolution roadmap, it is still the same. It's like moving in the same direction. And the question that then happens is, as for so many of the developing world, I'll speak for that, who feel this system feels increasingly unfair and illegitimate. And before it was, we've tried to pretend that maybe we weren't getting the issues or whatever. But now, with COVID and all that has happened, all that you pointed out, the alternative could be that we just go back to things as they were, which is what the World Bank seems to be doing. The World Bank president was quite clear, for example, on issues like private finance. I was saying this is another subtle form of privatization of public services, but he was quite clear about the direction they're heading. Do we just look more inwards? And that's what I'm struggling with, because you talk a bit about the opportunities given by BRICS and so forth, but I still feel that we are at a point where we are so frustrated that it's tempting to look inward, which is not the way I think we should go.
Yeah.
But even the UN Secretary General just brought it up. Uganda hosted the G20, and the key thing that came through for everyone, this has not really happened in a while, the reform of the international economic financial architecture. So
no, it's a great point and a good point to end on. Who wants to quickly field this one? Ndongo, you want to take the...
Yeah, maybe to say that, the World Bank is currently the agent of what Daniela Gabor, professor of macroeconomics, calls the macrofinance, calls the Wall Street consensus. That means this new view arriving after the Wall Street consensus, which consists of saying that now global private finance will be the main agent of economic development, will be the main agent to solve the climate crisis. And now the role of multilateral development banks, the states, is to provide the appropriate incentive structures so that global private finance will meet, its criteria in terms of investability. That means the profile in terms of returns, in terms of risk, etc. And this is a new so-called development model, and it is really compatible with industrial policy, but industrial policy that are driven by global private finance, and which generally will have outcomes that are unfair when it comes, to social provisioning, but also when it comes also to state spending and taxation. And these are the kind of things we could see in a developing country through, for example, the use of public-private partnerships in domains where, the state, the developmental state, would be much more efficient and also much more fair in its outcomes than, having recourse to global private finance.
Okay, I'm going to give Joe the very quick last word.
Well, I think one has to continue to get engaged in reforming these institutions, as difficult as it is. And the same thing, IFI, the IMF. The reality is that in the absence of rules, we have the law of the jungle. And in the law of the jungle, it is the powerful who win without any being circumscribed. So what worries me is that without any rules, things could even be worse. So the question is, if you have, that's why one needs to have academic, civil society, the kind of discussion, Oxfam, discussion we're having, to try to move these institutions and create new institutions that help create an understanding, norms, not only rules, but norms, an understanding of the inequities of the current system that maybe will circumscribe some of the worst behavior.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. And what I love about this panel and all of you and this venue with Oxfam and Ford is that we are rewriting the rules and assumptions on which the system is based. So that's a great place to end. Let me have Kate come up and say a couple words.
So thank you so much to this amazing panel, to Rana for moderating so deftly, to Joe and to Adriana and to Ndongo for these really insightful reflections. It's been a really, I think, inspiring and political discussion, and I really hope that all of us can take all of these insights and reflections into our meetings and events over the next few days, and especially when we're in rooms, when we hear people trying to kind of narrow down the conversation about the international financial architecture, when we hear people narrowing it down to just kind of balance sheet optimization or how do we maximize private finance for development, I really hope we can channel these four brilliant thinkers. Because we really need, as I think this discussion has illustrated, we need fundamental change in the mandates and governance and policies of the IFIs. So just to close, I will say that we have recorded this event, so we will circulate it. Give us a little bit of time to get over Spring Meetings Week, but we will circulate the recording. And I just want to say thank you, of course, again to Rana and the wonderful panel, to the Economic and Racial Justice team at Oxfam America, and my wonderful team at Oxfam International in DC. And also to the Ford Foundation, whose support has made this event possible, and also to all the staff at the Hay Adams Hotel who've done all the really important work of bringing our food and all that kind of thing, without which we would be very grumpy. So thank you all so much, and good luck this week. Thank you.